Okay, hello everyone. My name is Aldo Aguirre Camacho. I have been collaborating with the Spanish National Association of Pulmonary Hypertension for almost 10 years now. During this time, I have been doing research about the psychosocial determinants of the quality of life of patients with pulmonary hypertension. And also, I have been working as a psychologist offering support to both patients and family members. So today I have this presentation prepared for you titled Attaining Good Quality of Life While Living with a Chronic and Serious Condition. So why talking about quality of life in the context of pulmonary hypertension or also in the context of serious mental health or in the context of chronic conditions in general? Well, the answer perhaps you will most often hear to this question is because serious chronic health conditions have the potential to impact virtually all life domains of a person. And I mean, this is of course also true for pulmonary hypertension. And when you have this type of conditions, given their impact on many different life areas, many people can see their coping resources depleted. And this is when they find themselves at an increased risk of developing mental health problems of clinical significance, like for example, clinical anxiety or clinical depression. However, it is a fact that the majority of people that develop a serious chronic condition don't go on to actually develop serious mental health problems. I mean, they may go through an initial stage of adjustment to the newly graded altered circumstances. But after that, you find that many people living with the majority living with chronic conditions do relatively well. This, however, doesn't mean that these people face challenges or don't face challenges in their daily life, or that they don't face difficulties associated with living with a chronic condition. And in this regard, it's also important to talk about prevention to help these people stay away from mental health problems and to preventing any problems that may occur, and also to help these people adjust to what it is their new normal after being diagnosed with a serious chronic condition. In fact, these two aspects, both the prevention of mental health problems and adjustment to the new normal, are very important aspects in the field of health psychology. And I feel that they don't deserve often, or they don't get the attention that they should, given their importance. And today, I precisely want to focus on these last two aspects, on how to prevent mental health problems while living with a chronic condition, and how to foster adjustment to new circumstances. So with that in mind, I wanted to introduce you to the psychological flexibility model. And I wanted to tell you about why this model is relevant to people living with serious chronic conditions. So briefly, when we talk about a model in clinical psychology, we are referring to a general approach or a theoretical framework from which we can understand symptoms, we can understand mental health problems, from which we can also conceptualize treatments, conceptualize different techniques to help people. And I'm sure you're familiar or you have heard about different models in clinical psychology. For example, psychoanalysis, Gestalt, cognitive behavioral therapy. These are models that are entirely different and are based on different assumptions. Why the psychological flexibility model and why it's relevant in the context of serious chronic conditions. So I want to highlight that this model emphasizes a few aspects that arguably are high relevance to people living with chronic conditions. For example, acceptance. One of the things I have heard from patients with pulmonary hypertension, but also from patients dealing with other types of chronic conditions, is that accepting the new circumstances, accepting the challenges, the psychological challenges, emotional challenges, is something that becomes very hard. As is acceptance, in fact, is often felt as something that needs to be addressed again and again. It's not something that you do once and leave behind you. There is also an emphasis from this perspective on the living here and now. Again, this is another aspect that I have heard based on my experience with patients with chronic conditions, that many patients have told me that they, as the result of their condition, they have developed an appreciation for living life day by day. And that they have also developed an appreciation of the importance of living in the here and now. And this is also what research and other authors and clinicians have noticed, that this is often something very common among people with chronic health conditions, and in fact, something important to ensure there is good quality of life. But most importantly, from the perspective of this model, is its emphasis on having a life that matters. In fact, work on acceptance, on helping patients develop acceptance and helping patients live in the here and now, are not seen as ends in themselves in this model, even though they are important. They are actually seen as means to enable people to find their path, or to refine their path after being diagnosed with a serious condition, and live a life that matters to them. There is also something else. Oh, before I go on, actually, again, this is not, I just want to make clear that this is not my personal perspective. I'm a firm believer on evidence-based practice. And the reason I'm presenting this model to you today is because you see, over the last 2 decades, this is quite a recent model, by the way. It was started to be developed from the 70s, 80s, but it is from the late 90s and the beginning of the century when you start seeing quite a few studies done on populations of chronic individuals of chronic conditions. So it is a model that is becoming quite relevant in this realm. Something else I wanted to mention, because it is in fact drastically different from other approaches that we may be very used to, is one of the basic assumptions of this model. And this model is based on the assumption that pain and suffering are normal aspects of the human condition, as they constitute natural consequences of living. Based on this perspective, pain and suffering are conceptualized quite broadly, and they are conceptualized as the result of the discrepancy that we often experience between the way things are and the way we would want things to be. So I'm sure you can think of many aspects in your life that perhaps you wish were a bit different, at least. And this is actually something quite common, not really for people living with chronic conditions. In fact, if you think of people that have, from your perspective, anything that anyone can have in life, like good looks, good health, good family, good friends, lots of money, good careers. I mean, I'm sure you could think of cases where you can see this type of people also suffering and sometimes even being miserable. So again, suffering here from the perspective is actually seen as the normal condition in life. And this might sound negative, but at the same time might also sound liberating, and it might help us normalize that sometimes some of the things we may experience, even if they're unwanted, are quite normal. Before I continue, I also wanted to highlight that this perspective is drastically different from, for example, traditional models in medicine. If you take the biomedical model, for example, according to the biomedical model, what is normal is for people to be healthy. From this perspective, the perspective of the biomedical model, disease, in fact, is actually seen as a deviation from that state of normality. And even though this model has some limitations, in many cases works quite well, because the model serves its objectives well, because what it matters is to take these people that become sick and restore their health. So there are means and to actually help people who are sick and to get them healthy again. So that works. Limitations that you can think about the biomedical model, for example, chronic conditions perhaps are not very well accounted for by this model. And I think in the field of pulmonary hypertension over the last very few years, we have started to see debates on the importance of giving patients their perspective, on the importance of certain things that are important to quality of life that are being missed by these traditional approaches to understanding health and illness. So we can see also that this is a model that is not perfect, the biomedical model. However, I mean, there is no denying in that this model has been highly influential in medicine. And there are more recent models that, for example, the biopsychosocial model, are better able to accommodate some of the limitations of its previous model. But this model has also, the biomedical model has been also quite influential in psychology. I mean, the idea that the normal thing in psychology is to be healthy, is to be happy, is to be content with life is something that is also present in other ways of understanding mental health problems and other ways of conceptualizing what clinical psychology should be like. And this is something also that it has predated day-to-day life. I mean, we are from day to day bombarded with lots of information regarding thousand millions ways in which we can be happy, about many things that we could do, many things that we could buy in the same way that you buy any other good that will ensure happiness. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, happiness is not found on the outside. And again, going back to this basic assumption of the psychological flexibility model, suffering is quite normal when it comes to being human. So what is the psychological flexibility model? So this model is based on 6 interconnected factors. I'm going to be talking briefly about these factors in a moment, and I'm going to be referring to why these factors may be or are relevant for people living with serious chronic health conditions. The psychological flexibility model is at the same time a model of psychological health and at the same simultaneously a model of psychopathology or a model of mental health problems. Because as I will be mentioning, each of these 6 factors has a dark side, if you will. So things can go wrong when each or all of the 6 factors don't work as they should. And each of these 6 factors is proposed to foster, and it has been found in research to foster psychological flexibility, which is sort of an integration of the 6 factors coming together. So I wanted to start by talking about acceptance and cognitive diffusion. Those are 2 factors that you can see on the left-hand side of the model. So acceptance, from the perspective of the psychological flexibility model, has been defined as intentionally open and non-judgmental posture with respect to moment-to-moment experience. So what does this mean? Intentionally open means that there is a factor of willingness to letting experiences that sometimes may be aversive in a way, that may be unwanted. So there has to be some willingness to make those experiences also part of our life, to make some room in our life to feel also those experiences. If you think about it, this is something that many people might not be willing to do. In fact, human beings are also in a way wired to escape painful experiences. So this is something that clashes with what this model proposes. There is also an aspect of non-judgment of our experiences. I think from the time we're very little, we learn to judge our experiences. So we learn that things like sadness is bad, things like anger is bad, and things like joy and happiness are good. So based on the judgments, sometimes we become more open or close to certain types of experiences, or circumstances that may evoke those experiences in our lives. So again, it is important to work in acceptance. And I mean, I'm just telling you about this in this presentation, but be mindful that when doing clinical work, when doing psychotherapy based on this model, this work can take some time. I mean, it's something that might be counterintuitive to be open and to be accepting of things that may seem aversive or that may be harmful, like sadness, for example. This conceptualization of acceptance arguably is also quite different from what many of you may actually think of. Many people from day-to-day life may think of acceptance. And here acceptance is not seen as resignation or tolerance. I mean, often when we talk about acceptance in our day-to-day conversation, it may give, acceptance may have a connotation of giving up. Okay, so you have to accept it. I mean, you have to accept what happened. You have to resign, and you have to realize there's nothing you can do. Okay, so in this sense, acceptance is seen in a way as passive. But again, from the perspective of the psychological flexibility model, acceptance is actually something active. You have to be quite proactive into being willing to let in those experiences that may be difficult for you to deal with. Cognitive diffusion is also, lots of work is devoted to cognitive diffusion, and this is the skill and ability to distance ourselves from the literal contents of our mind. Our minds are entities that seem to have a life of their own, and we continuously, there may be internal narratives, internal dialogues, or monologues inside our minds, saying things, telling us things, okay? And often, as I would just talk about in the next slides, it might be difficult to gain some distance from that internal dialogue. So again, something that is actually done, or also done from this perspective in clinical work, is to teach patients to gain some distance and to become observers of those dialogues that take place inside their minds. So what happens when there is little acceptance, and what happens when we don't work on good diffusion skills? Well, this model proposes that two things happen. First, experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance is defined as a deliberate attempt to suppress and control distressing experiences or situations that evoke them. I want to point out that experiential avoidance is something that is not necessarily negative if done from time to time. However, here the problem is when this becomes the pattern of dealing with experiences that may be aversive to us. Chronic health conditions are perhaps, in many cases, a life context of a life situation that can evoke lots of experiences, lots of aversive experiences. I mean, people who live with chronic conditions, they undergo many changes in their lives. They sometimes mourn the loss of different aspects in their life, health, perhaps some roles, careers. And the problem with experiential avoidance is that when this becomes the pattern of dealing with this difficult situation or difficult experiences, difficult emotions, difficult thoughts, this exacerbates mental health problems. And this is what many different studies carried out in different conditions have shown. Why is this? Well, different reasons. I mean, first, it doesn't really work. I mean, the attempt to control or suppress our emotional experience, our inner experiences, our thoughts, our memories just doesn't work. And this again might be a little bit counterintuitive and may also crash with some of the things that you may have heard before. And I have certainly heard them. I mean, sometimes when I'm invited to give this type of presentations or workshops, some of the things I'm asking, I want you to give a presentation of how to control your emotions or how to keep your emotions at bay. And this is something that we may hear a lot from day to day lay people saying, but it's something that is being shown again and again in many different types of studies that doesn't work. It is impossible to really control our emotions indefinitely. In the short term, yes, it might work. Okay? But what different studies have shown is that when this becomes the pattern, what happens is that individuals experience an upsurge in the intensity and frequency with which the emotions that we're trying to avoid are experienced. So this is something that truly backfires. These two aspects are actually in fact quite related. I mean, cognitive fusion, it happens when we fail to distinguish reality, the things that are actually happening here and now in our life, with we fail to distinguish that from what is actually happening inside our minds. Take, for example, someone that tells you, I will be unable to give a presentation because I'm afraid of speaking in public. Okay? So that person may have that thought popping into his mind. And as a result of that thought, that person may experience high levels of anxiety. Okay? However, that's only a thought. I mean, however, you can see that reactions sometimes to these types of thoughts may be quite similar to reactions to actual situations. I mean, here you have this person reacting to a single thought in the same way as if he, in fact, was standing before a crowd and was about to give a public presentation. So what happens is that sometimes we also can become avoidant with that internal narrative, with those internal dialogues. So here we are trying to control, suppress the emotions that may emerge as a result of the things that we think. And we may also try to suppress that type of thoughts, but it's impossible. I mean, if I tell you not to think of pink elephants, that's the one thing you're going to do because it is impossible to suppress thoughts. I'm feeling I'm leaving something out here. Okay, experiential avoidance, cognitive fusion. Okay, I'm sure it will come out later on. Oh yes. So it's not only the attempts to suppress and control experiences. People also start avoiding situations that may evoke certain types of experiences or emotions. So think about that. What are the implications that can have for treatment? Think about people that may not be willing to talk about the problems or to talk about their conditions, or sometimes they have a very difficult time going for appointments to the point that sometimes they may decide to skip appointments, or to the point that they may not be willing to, if they have problems, severe problems, they may not be willing to perhaps talk to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, because they may not be willing or they may be unable to actually to deal with experiences that this type of situations may evoke. And therefore, they attempt to suppress those by not putting themselves into specific situations where these types of emotions or experiences may emerge. So again, this may actually be quite restrictive when people engage in experiential avoidance as the type of coping mechanism. Their lives can be quite restricted because they may stop doing many things that may be important to them. We move on to two other aspects here of the psychological flexibility model. I want to start with present moment, being in the here and now. And this is, I think, is quite intuitively the meaning of this aspect. About being consciously centered in the social, physical, and psychological present. And it seems that this is becoming harder and harder with the type of society we're living in. And certainly living with a chronic condition can make it even harder to sometimes remembering to being present. what happens is that for many people, not only people living with serious chronic conditions, is that most often our minds is either in the past or in the future. Okay? In the past, ruminating about things that may have happened or how things may have been, or some of the things that we could have done differently, and if only this and if only that. And I mean, that creates a vicious cycle. In that, what happens is that sometimes it can be quite natural to try to employ strategies that do work in the external work, but do not really work when it comes to the psychological realm. For example, problem solving, okay? Problem solving is great for many things that in the external world, okay? If we have a problem, if our car is broken, we know that one of the things we have to do is pick up the phone. We have to take the car to a mechanic. The mechanic goes in the car, finds the piece that is not working, replaces that piece, and problem solved, okay? However, sometimes these type of strategies don't work well when we are dealing with our psychological different factors like emotion, thoughts, memories. I mean, it doesn't really matter how much we go into the past to try to see how things were different, that chances are that we won't really be able to change much, okay? However, this is something that we can do quite often. And also, sometimes we can spend lots of time in the future, in an imagined future, a future that may happen one day, but may not really happen. Getting ahead of things, thinking about how things may be, what we could do to try to get the exact type of future that we want, or perhaps even thinking about future threats. Threats that may happen, but threats that in many cases may not happen. And this may be also quite relevant to people living with chronic conditions, from worrying to the next appointment, to worrying whether I'm going to have the results in the test that I'm hoping for, or whether the results are going to be worse than I want, and what I will be able to do, whether I will be able to face the situation or how I'm going to feel. And what happens again, when this becomes the pattern, we are left with, I mean, the present really gets crushed by the past and the future. And again, it is in the present when, according to the psychological flexibility model, we can find cues that will allow us to behave in a way that may be more functional based on what we want in life and based on what life is telling us at the moment. So if we don't contact the present, if we are not very attentive to what is happening in the here and now, we may miss on those cues, and we may not actually be able to make necessary changes, even though the universe, even though life may be screaming that we make some changes because some strategies may not be working. So I have to point out that dwelling in the past or thinking about the future, I mean, often doesn't really work. It doesn't change things. It doesn't fix things. And I also want to point out it is actually quite natural for our minds to do this type of things. Okay, and there is no point in trying to stop them from doing this. The important thing is to create the skills to being aware of where our attentional focus is, whether it is in the past and the future, and to remember to bring that attentional focus back to the present. And this is something also that is clinical work is done in this realm, from this perspective, from the perspective of the psychological flexibility model. And I'm sure many of you have tried meditation sometimes. I mean, meditation, there is a close relation to Eastern philosophies and all that, but really at its core, meditation is just a way of training our attentional focus, is to really strengthen that muscle, attentional muscle, so that we know and we realize where our attention is, and so that we are in better control of our attention. Okay? And we can easily realize when our attention has just gone to the past or the future. I also wanted to talk about another of the 6 aspects, self as context. And in doing that, I wanted to show you this landscape. Self as context as opposed to self as content. If you're seeing this beautiful landscape, if I asked you to describe this landscape, I'm sure you can find many different descriptors to describe this. And we do exactly the same thing with our lives and with ourselves. We all have, I bet all of us have, a very conceptualized self. If we were asked to tell someone else how we are, we could use lots of traits to describe ourselves to others. I'm an extrovert, I'm honest, I'm conscientious, and easygoing, and so forth and so forth. Um, this is a type of self that is in fact quite reinforced in Western societies. I mean, since the time we are very little, we are supposed to know ourselves. Okay, we are supposed to provide others with a description of exactly how we are. An alternative to this is an alternative that is often more characteristics of Eastern societies, where self is not a number of traits with descriptors, but mostly as a process. Okay, one way to approach this landscape is to describe it, but another way to approach this landscape is to just observe it. If you could imagine observing this landscape as if you were actually there, you could spend a couple of hours and you could see how clouds come and go, how birds come and go, how the breeze comes and go. You spend 1 year, you could see also changes having to do with different seasons. And arguably, this is something that can also be done with our lives. We can picture our lives as a photograph, and we can see ourselves at different points in our lives as we're children, youth, young adults, older adults. And you can see change. You can see how we have changed. You can see how you have even changed in a day as you play different roles in your life. However, there is one thing that remains constant. And that is you doing the observing, okay? So that sense of you as the observer, not attached to any descriptors, not attached to any traits, is another way in which the self, the sense of self, is fostered from the perspective of the psychological flexibility model. So what is the problem with having a conceptualized or having self as a number of descriptors is that sometimes people can get very attached to those labels. Sorry. And sometimes they use those traits as, or they think of those traits as if there were actually things that exist, okay? So you can say that in this landscape, there is a tree in the background and the tree is actually there. But another thing is that you are saying that you are arguably an extrovert, as if extroversion was actually a thing that you can locate inside you in the same way that you can locate a stomach or a lung, okay? So this can create problems, for example, when someone that is afraid, or even though it might be important to him to give public presentations, tells you that he's unable to give public presentations because he has social anxiety. Okay? Social anxiety here is being treated as a thing, something that exists, and is many people may firmly believe that that thing is preventing them from doing other things in life. So sometimes attachment, this is an example of how attachments to that conceptualization that we may have of ourselves sometimes prevent us from doing certain things. And we can think also about this in the context of chronic health conditions. I mean, many people may think I can't do this or I can't do that because I'm dealing with a chronic condition, or because I'm dealing with anxiety or I'm dealing with depression. And if you think about self-context, I mean, another positive aspects and another reason this is fostered in clinical work is because we are more than the things that have happened in our lives, or I mean, we were in our lives before many things in our lives happen. And there will be many things in our life that will happen, that will cease to happen. And yet we will continue to be here. Okay. So again, this is a factor that is closely related to the idea of being in the here and now, to the idea of having a sense of where our attention is, to diminish the fusion that we may have with our internal narratives or with the internal conceptualizations that we may have developed about ourselves. Finally, I have arrived to the factors located at the right-hand side of the model. And again, this is really the ultimate goal from clinical work done from this perspective. And one of the things that is important is to get patients to get very clear idea about what the values are, what the freely chosen values are, because values sometimes can be imposed. Okay, for example, you know, my partner think I should be like this or like that, for example. And freely chosen values is in fact what is fostered from this perspective, because the important thing is that clients actually have a clear idea of what is important to them in their lives. Something else I have heard about, or from many people living with chronic conditions, is that chronic conditions have provided them with an opportunity to put things into perspective in their lives. Okay? This is something that often is done. It comes in naturally to think about one's life, to think about the things that are not given the importance they deserve. Okay, and many people tend to get closer to those things that they value most in their lives after they are diagnosed with a chronic condition. However, it may be also the case that chronic condition can be quite disruptive, and many people can also lose the sense of direction, their sense of meaning and purpose in their life. So something that is done from this perspective, clinical work, is to reconnect people with truly chosen values, because values, when living with a chronic condition or without a chronic condition, can be seen as a compass. They provide us with a sense of direction. They provide us with the type of things, the type of life that we actually want to live. And the important thing is, I mean, it's great to be clear about what our values are, but even most important is to be able to guide our actions from day to day in the direction of those values. In fact, when we do know what our values are, but when we have to do other things that move us away from our values, I mean, I think most of us, not anyone, can experience a sense of wasting the time, or perhaps a sense that we are not being true to ourselves. Okay. So again, serious chronic conditions can be disruptive, can really make people feel that life has no meaning. And that's why it's important to work on these aspects, on refinding those fully chosen values, and to do things from day to day in the direction of those values. And again, this is when we're just talking about acceptance or being in the here and now. I mean, those are things that are done in the service of this. Okay, when people are able to become acceptant of different or type of experiences, even of experiences that may be aversive, is in the service of this, in the service of living the life that they may want. Someone that is afraid of giving a public presentation may have a value on, may really appreciate the importance of education, the importance of having a good career, the importance of one day being someone highly educated so that he can do something for society. So arguably, the feelings of anxiety that person may have about giving a public presentation it's not really the feelings of anxiety, it's whether that person is willing to go there and give a public presentation despite anxiety. So acceptance is something that is done, is in clinical work, something that is fostered in the service of values and in the service of living the life that we choose to live. Okay, this is not the anxiety itself. What is the problem? Is whether we are willing or not to make room for that anxiety, because we cannot suppress it, we cannot control it. Is whether we are willing to make room for that anxiety, and despite of that anxiety, behave or live the life that we want to live. So when people are unable to get in touch with their values, or they are unable to live their life they want to live, it's often the case that they are prey of experiential avoidance, that their minds are in the past or in the future. They are devoting way too much time to rumination, to think about potential future threats. So they become reactive of those experiences. Their lives are not being lived in the service of doing things that may be good for us, but in the service of escaping things that are being aversive. Okay, that tends to become what happens from day to day. Every day is a day that is living in avoidance, or that is living escaping emotions, thoughts, or even situations that may evoke different types of avoidance. So what can happen in extreme cases to some people where passivity, withdrawal, they may withdraw from social life, they may decide not to put themselves in situations where they may feel certain things that they're not open to feel. Or on the contrary, they sometimes engage in numbing behaviors. So things like drug use or alcohol. I mean, drug use and alcohol at first sight may seem quite different from passivity and withdrawal, but they seek the same purpose. And the same purpose is not to feel certain things, not to feel sadness, not to feel anxiety, not to feel desperation. Okay. So those are behaviors that can be drastically different, but they are pursuits in the service of avoiding. So then what is psychological flexibility? I always tend to start my presentation with definitions, but I think this is a concept that perhaps after explaining all these other factors may come in as a little more clearer. Psychological flexibility is the ability to stay in contact with the present moment, regardless of unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations. So if the present moment is evoking all this type of aversive emotions, I mean, it's the willingness to still remain in the here and now, despite the aversive emotions, that's the willingness and ability to stay in the here and now, despite any unpleasant experiences we may feel. And based on what the current situation affords, based on what life may be telling us in a specific situation, based on what life may be telling us in the here and now, persists or change our behavior in the service of attaining things that are important to us. So in other words, psychological flexibility entails being open, being willing to feel the full repertoire of experiences that we may feel, because doing that is important, because doing that allows us not to engage in unnecessarily avoidance or escaping, and allow us to remain in the present, because it is in the present where we can find cues as to what are the things that we could do to live a life that matters, to live a life that is well aligned with our values. Why is psychological flexibility important? I mean, over the past few years, we have been talking about things like, especially in the pulmonary hypertension community, things like self-management, empowerment, engagement, quality of life. And these are aspects that, to a large extent, are the result of how we choose to behave, are the result of how we choose to live. Okay. It is a fact that medicine can do a lot to increase. There is something that can be, lots of things can be done from a medical perspective to increase the quality of life of patients living with chronic conditions. But even though there is a lot, there is also a limitation. Medicine can only do so much. Many other aspects of living with chronic conditions, when it comes to achieving high quality of life, are the result of the things that we do. Self-management requires that we do certain things from day to day, despite anything else. Empowerment, we have been talking about how we want patients to be more engaged, how sometimes difficulties or mental health problems or suffering or stress can get in the way, but still being engaged is being engaged despite many other things. So again, it is important to work on prevention. It is important to work on the promotion of mental health, because psychology and health psychology is not only there to treat problems, it's also there to enable people to continue their process of personal growth and to continue to move closer and closer to their values and to get in the path of the type of life they want to live. So before I finish, I wanted to introduce you. Some of you may be already familiar with these two books. That sometimes picking up self-help books can be tricky, especially if we don't know the type of things we want to read about or the type of authors that are important. Okay, so the reason I'm presenting these two books to you is because these two authors, Stephen Hayes and Jod Kabat-Zinn, have been the founders of their respective models of clinical work in health psychology. Stephen Hayes was one of the authors that, perhaps the main authors that started working on acceptance and commitment therapy, which is the type of therapy based on the psychological flexibility model. And Jod Kabat-Zinn was the one author that introduced mindfulness in Western societies. I mean, mindfulness has been a practice for many thousands of years in Eastern traditions. However, Jod Kabat-Zinn started to work with mindfulness with people with chronic pain. I mean, chronic pain is another condition that can be very difficult and very challenging to live with. And since then, mindfulness has been developed in many different types of intervention and applied to the context of many different types of chronic health conditions. So again, these are two good resources, and they go into much more detail on some of the things I have talked about here today. And I hope, for those of you interested in reading them, I hope that you find them useful. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And right now I'm here to open to answer any questions or any comments that you may have. Thank you very much.